Well now, child, settle yourself down real comfortable like in that chair. 'Cause old Granny Abby's got herself a tale tonight that's different from all the supernatural stories I've been telling you. This here's about something that happened in the flesh and blood world, about real people facing real danger, and about the kind of courage that don't need magic or mysterious powers to change everything. This is the story of Eleanor Rodriguez, though most folks in Dry Creek called her simply the Mexican woman back in those days when people weren't as enlightened as they ought to be. It happened in the summer of 1879, when I was a young woman of 20, newly married to my Thomas and living in what was then one of the roughest towns in all of Arizona Territory. Dry Creek wasn't much to look at, just a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single dusty main street. With a saloon that never seemed to close and a sheriff who spent more time drunk than sober, it was the kind of place where decent folks kept their heads down and their mouths shut, where asking too many questions could get you a bullet in the back, and where the law was whatever the man with the fastest gun said it was. The town had been founded by cattle ranchers and silver miners, but by '79 it had become a haven for every kind of outlaw and desperado you could imagine: rustlers, claim jumpers, bank robbers, and killers. They all passed through Dry Creek at one time or another, knowing they could find sanctuary there as long as they had money to spend and weren't too particular about the company they kept. The man who really ran things wasn't our worthless sheriff, but a gunfighter named Jake Morrison, no relation to the good Morrison family I've mentioned in other stories. This Jake Morrison was a different breed entirely, a cold-blooded killer who'd built himself a little empire of fear and intimidation in our corner of the territory. Morrison had a gang of 6 men who were nearly as dangerous as he was, and together they controlled everything that happened in Dry Creek. They decided who could open businesses, who could stay in town, and who needed to disappear permanently. The legitimate ranchers and miners paid them protection money, the saloon gave them free drinks, and even the preacher had to ask permission before holding services. Thomas and I had come to Dry Creek because he'd gotten work at the silver mine, and we were young and foolish enough to think we could make a good life anywhere as long as we had each other. We rented a little house on the edge of town, kept to ourselves, and tried not to attract the attention of Morrison and his gang. But it was impossible to live in Dry Creek without witnessing the casual cruelty that marked daily life under Morrison's rule. I saw him pistol whip a shopkeeper who was slow making change. I watched his men terrorize a family of homesteaders until they abandoned their claim and fled the territory. I heard the screams coming from the back room of the saloon where Morrison questioned people who'd crossed him. The worst part was how everyone just accepted it, like Morrison's reign of terror was a natural disaster that couldn't be fought or changed. People would whisper complaints in private, but in public they smiled and nodded and pretended everything was fine. Fear had become so much a part of daily life that most folks couldn't even imagine what it would be like to live without it. That's the world Eleanor Rodriguez walked into on a Tuesday morning in June, stepping off the stage from Tucson with nothing but a carpet bag in her hand and a look of determination in her dark eyes that should have warned everyone she wasn't like the other women who'd passed through our town. She was maybe 30 years old, with black hair braided down her back and skin bronzed by the desert sun. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself with the kind of dignity that made you forget about the patches and the faded fabric. There was something about the way she moved, the way she looked directly at people instead of keeping her eyes downcast, that marked her as different from the start. Eleanor took a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, the same Mrs. Patterson from my other stories, though this was years before the supernatural troubles that would later plague her family. She paid for a week in advance with silver coins that gleamed like they'd just been minted. And when Mrs. Patterson asked what brought her to Dry Creek, Eleanor's answer was simple and direct. "I'm looking for someone," she said in English that carried just a trace of an accent. "A man who killed my husband and took something that belongs to me. I have reason to believe he's here." Those words, "I'm looking for someone who killed my husband," spread through Dry Creek faster than wildfire through dry grass. Child. In a town where most folks were either running from their past or trying to forget it. The arrival of someone actively hunting for justice was like dropping a lit match into a powder keg. I first heard about Eleanor from Mrs. Patterson herself, who came to visit me that very afternoon with her face flushed from excitement and worry. "Abby," she said, settling into my kitchen chair and accepting the coffee I offered, "we've got ourselves a situation brewing. This Mexican woman who just arrived, she's not here by accident." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "She's carrying a gun," Mrs. Patterson whispered, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Not hidden away in her luggage like a sensible woman would, but strapped to her hip like she knows how to use it. And when she registered at the boarding house, she signed her name as Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez, which means she's a widow, and from the look in her eyes, she didn't become one peacefully." That evening, Thomas came home from the mine with more details about our mysterious visitor. The men had been talking about her all day, speculating about what kind of trouble she might bring to town. Word is she spent the afternoon asking questions. He told me as we sat down to supper, visiting the saloon, the general store, even the livery stable, showing people a daguerreotype and asking if they'd seen the man in the picture. "What did the picture show?" I asked. "Nobody got a good look at it," Thomas replied, "but from what I heard, it was a man with dark hair and a scar across his left cheek." Eleanor told folks his name was Carlos Mendoza and that he was wanted for murder down in Sonora. My blood ran cold at that description, because I'd seen a man matching those details around town just a few weeks earlier. He'd been drinking with Morrison's gang at the saloon, and from the way they'd treated him, it was clear he was someone important, maybe even someone Morrison was considering adding to his crew. The next morning brought the confrontation that would change everything for our little town. I was hanging laundry behind our house when I heard raised voices coming from the direction of Main Street, curious despite my better judgment. I made my way to the front of our property where I could see what was happening. Eleanor Rodriguez was standing in the middle of the dusty street, facing the saloon where Morrison and his men spent most of their time. She traded her simple brown dress for dark pants and a white shirt, with a gun belt around her waist that held a Colt revolver that looked well maintained and frequently used. Her black hair was still braided, but now it was pinned up in a way that wouldn't interfere with her movements if trouble started. "Carlos Mendoza," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I know you're in there. Come out and face me like the man you pretend to be." The saloon door swung open, and out stepped not Carlos Mendoza, but Jake Morrison himself. He was a tall man, lean as a whip and twice as dangerous, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. He wore his guns low on his hips, and everyone in town knew he could draw and fire faster than most men could blink. "Well, well," Morrison drawled, his voice carrying that lazy menace that made smart people find somewhere else to be. "Looks like we got ourselves a little segreta with big ideas. You best put that iron away, girl, before you hurt yourself." Eleanor didn't move. Didn't even flinch at the obvious threat in Morrison's words. "I'm not here for you, Morrison. I want Carlos Mendoza. Send him out, and I'll take my business elsewhere." "Mendoza's under my protection," Morrison replied, his hand drifting toward his gun, "which means anyone who's got a problem with him has got a problem with me, and I don't much like problems." That's when Eleanor did something that made every person watching, including me, gasp in shock and disbelief. She smiled, not the nervous smile of someone trying to defuse a dangerous situation, but the cold, confident smile of a predator who'd just spotted prey. "Good," she said simply, "because I don't much like bullies who hide behind their reputations instead of facing their responsibilities." The street fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the buildings and the distant sound of horses moving in the livery stable. Everyone knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come, the moment when someone finally stood up to Jake Morrison and his reign of terror. Morrison's face went white with rage, and his hand moved to his gun. But before he could draw, Eleanor spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Before you do something you'll regret, Morrison, you might want to know who you're dealing with. My name is Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez, and I'm the daughter of Don Miguel Rodriguez, who owns half of Sonora. My husband was Captain Roberto Vasquez of the Mexican Army, and he was murdered by Carlos Mendoza during a robbery that your friend thought would go unnoticed." She paused, letting that information sink in before delivering the words that would seal both their fates. "I've come here to collect what Mendoza stole, my husband's family ring and the gold he was carrying for the army payroll. And I'm prepared to go through anyone who stands in my way." The silence that followed Eleanor's declaration stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Child, you could have heard a pin drop in that dusty street, with half the town watching from behind windows and doorways, afraid to breathe too loud lest they draw attention to themselves. Jake Morrison stood there with his hand hovering over his gun, his pale eyes calculating the odds of facing down a woman who clearly wasn't intimidated by his reputation. But it was what happened next that truly showed the measure of Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez. Instead of waiting for Morrison to make his move, instead of backing down or trying to negotiate, she took a step forward, just one step. But it might as well have been a mile for all the courage it took. "I can see you're thinking, Morrison," she said, her voice steady as bedrock. "You're wondering if I'm bluffing, if I really know how to use this gun, if I'm worth the trouble of killing. Let me save you some time. I learned to shoot from my father's vaqueros, men who could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 50 paces. My husband taught me military tactics. And the Apaches who raided our ranch taught me that sometimes you have to fight dirty to survive." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he still didn't draw. Something in Eleanor's manner, in the way she carried herself, was giving him pause. This wasn't some hysterical woman seeking revenge. This was a trained fighter who'd come prepared for war. "You're making a mistake, Segurita," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying less of its usual lazy confidence. "Even if you're as good as you claim, I've got 6 men backing me up. You might get me, but you'll never get all of us." Eleanor's smile widened, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold, not fear or anger, but the kind of cold calculation that marked a true killer. "Who said I was planning to face all of you at once?" That's when Carlos Mendoza himself finally appeared in the saloon doorway. Drawn by the commotion and probably curious about who was calling his name, he was a stocky man, with greasy black hair and a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of scar that comes from a knife fight where the other person didn't survive. The moment Eleanor saw him, her entire demeanor changed. The cold smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of such pure hatred that it made Morrison take an involuntary step backward. This wasn't about money or justice anymore. This was personal, intimate, the kind of rage that comes from watching someone you love die at the hands of a coward. "Carlos," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly to every person watching. "Did you think you could hide forever? Did you think I wouldn't find you? Mendoza's face went pale as desert sand, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. But Eleanor was faster, her Colt clearing leather with a speed that made Morrison himself look slow. She didn't fire. Not yet. But the message was clear if Mendoza wanted to make this a gunfight. She was ready. Eleanor, Mendoza said, his voice cracking like a boy's. I didn't know you were alive. They told me the Apaches got everyone at the ranch. The Apaches got my husband, Eleanor replied, her gun steady as a rock. But not before he told me what really happened that night. How you came to our home under the flag of friendship, how you shared our food and our hospitality. How you waited until Roberto was asleep before you put a knife in his back and stole everything we had. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation began to murmur among themselves. Even in a town like Dry Creek, where violence was commonplace, there were still some lines that decent folks wouldn't cross. Killing a man in his sleep, betraying hospitality, stealing from the dead, these were the acts of a coward, not a gunfighter. Morrison sensed the shift in the crowd's mood and tried to regain control of the situation. That's enough talk, he said, his hand moving back toward his gun. Mendoza's under my protection, and I don't care what he might have done down in Mexico. This is American territory now, and Mexican law don't apply here. But Eleanor turned that cold gaze on him, and for the first time since I'd known of Jake Morrison, I saw uncertainty flicker in his pale eyes. You're right, she said, this is American territory, which means I have the right to call out the man who murdered my husband, unless you're planning to shoot an unarmed woman in the back. It was a masterful move, child. Eleanor had turned Morrison's own reputation against him. He'd built his power on being the fastest gun in the territory, on facing down other gunfighters in fair fights. If he shot Eleanor without giving her a chance to defend herself, he'd be seen as nothing more than a common murderer, and his carefully cultivated image would be destroyed. This ain't your fight. Morrison, Eleanor continued, pressing her advantage. Carlos Mendoza killed my husband and stole from me. I'm calling him out, fair and square. Unless you're saying your protection extends to helping cowards avoid the consequences of their actions. Morrison looked around at the crowd. Seeing the expectant faces of people who'd lived under his thumb for years, they were watching too. See what he'd do, how he'd handle this challenge to his authority. If he backed down now, if he let Eleanor face Mendoza alone, it would be seen as weakness. But if he intervened directly, he'd be breaking the unwritten code of the frontier that even outlaws were expected to follow. Fine, he said finally, stepping back but keeping his hand near his gun. You want to face Mendoza, you can face him. But when you're dead, I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows what happens to people who come here looking for trouble. Eleanor holstered her gun with the same fluid motion she'd used to draw it, then began walking toward the center of the street where gunfights were traditionally held. Carlos, she called over her shoulder. You've got 1 minute to decide whether you want to die like a man or like the coward you've always been. Carlos Mendoza stood frozen in the saloon doorway, child. His scarred face pale as winter snow as he stared at the woman who'd tracked him across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain to bring him tea. Oh, justice, his hand twitched toward his gun. But something in Eleanor's steady gaze made him hesitate. Maybe it was the knowledge that she'd already proven herself faster on the draw. Or maybe it was the weight of his own guilt finally catching up with him. 1 minute, Carlos, Eleanor repeated, her voice carrying across the silent street like the toll of a funeral bell. 1 minute to decide whether you want to face me like a man or die like the coward who murdered my husband in his sleep, but instead of accepting the challenge or backing down, Mendoza did something that surprised everyone watching. He turned and ran back into the saloon, shouting for Morrison's men to help him. The crowd let out a collective gasp of disgust at this display of cowardice, and I could see the contempt in their faces as they realized what kind of man Morrison had been protecting. Eleanor didn't pursue him immediately. Instead, she turned too, faced the crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation, her dark eyes scanning the faces of people who'd lived under Morrison's thumb for far too long. "You see," she called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the street. "This is the kind of man your Jake Morrison calls friend, a coward who kills sleeping men and runs when faced with honest Jay. Eustace, how many of you have suffered under Morrison's rule? How many of you have paid his protection money, endured his threats, watched him terrorize your families while you stood by and did nothing?" The crowd stirred uneasily, and I could see the shame and anger warring in their faces. Eleanor had touched on something that had been festering in the hearts of Dry Creek citizens for years, the knowledge that they'd allowed fear to turn them into accomplices to their own oppression. "I know you're scared," Eleanor continued, her voice gentler now, but no less determined. "I know Morrison and his men have convinced you that resistance is hopeless, that anyone who stands up to them will end up dead in the desert, but I'm here to tell you that's a lie. Bullies like Morrison only have power as long as good people are too afraid to stand together." That's when something remarkable happened. Child, old Pete Kowalski, the same Pete from my other stories, though this was years before he'd helped me fight supernatural threats, stepped out of the crowd and walked over to stand beside Eleanor. He was in his 50s then, a grizzled former cavalry sergeant who'd lost his left arm in the war between the states, but hadn't lost his courage. "The lady's right," Pete said in his gravelly voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been watching Morrison and his gang terrorize this town for 3 years now, and I'm sick to death of it. If this brave woman is willing to stand up to them, then by God, so am I." His words seemed to break a dam that had been holding back years of suppressed anger and frustration. One by one, other people began stepping forward, miners who'd been forced to pay protection money, shopkeepers who'd been robbed and beaten, ranchers who'd lost cattle to Morrison's taxes. Within minutes, Eleanor found herself surrounded by nearly 30 people, all of them ready to support her fight against the gang that had held their town hostage. But Jake Morrison wasn't about to let this challenge to his authority go unanswered. He emerged from the saloon with all 6 of his men, their guns drawn and their faces set in expressions of cold determination. Carlos Mendoza cowered behind them, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of real danger. "That's enough," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the street. "I don't know what kind of game you people think you're playing, but it ends now. Anyone who doesn't disperse in the next 30 seconds is going to find out what happens to troublemakers in my town." But Eleanor stepped forward, placing herself between Morrison's guns and the crowd of townspeople who'd rallied to her cause. "Your town," she said, her voice carrying a note of mockery that made Morrison's face flush with rage. "I don't see your name on any deeds or charters, Morrison. This is their town, and they have every right to decide who's welcome here and who needs to leave." "Rights," Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The only right that matters out here is the right of the fastest gun, and I'm the fastest gun in Arizona territory. You want to challenge that, Segarita? You're welcome to try." Eleanor's hand moved to her gun, but she didn't draw. Instead, she looked around at the faces of the people who'd chosen to stand with her, and I could see her making calculations, weighing the odds of a direct confrontation against the cost in innocent lives. "You're right about one thing, Morrison," she said finally. "This is about who's fastest with a gun. But it's not about me challenging you. It's about Carlos Mendoza answering for what he did to my who." Spand, you can step aside and let justice take its course, or you can make this about something bigger than one coward's crimes. Morrison's pale eyes narrowed as he realized what Eleanor was doing. She was giving him a choice: let her face Mendoza in a fair fight, or be seen as someone who protected murderers and cowards. Either way, his reputation would suffer. But one choice would cost him much more than the other. The standoff in the middle of Main Street stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, child. With Morrison and his 6 gunmen on one side and Eleanor backed by 30 angry townspeople on the other, the air was thick with tension and the smell of fierce sweat, and everyone knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine the fate of Dry Creek for years to come. Morrison was caught in a trap of his own making, and I could see him working through his options like a poker player trying to decide whether to fold or call a bluff. If he let Eleanor face Mendoza alone, he'd look weak in front of his men and the townspeople. But if he gunned down a woman backed by half the town, he'd turn himself from a feared leader into a common murderer that even his own gang might abandon. Tell you what, Segarita, Morrison said finally, his voice carrying that lazy drawl that had intimidated so many people over the years. I'll make you a deal. You want Mendoza so bad, you can have him, but only after you prove you're worthy of the privilege. Face me first, and if you win, Carlos is all yours. Eleanor's dark eyes flashed with understanding. Morrison was trying to turn this into a contest of reputations, a way to eliminate the threat she represented while maintaining his image as the fastest gun in the territory. If he killed her in a fair fight, the townspeople would have no choice but to accept that their champion had been bested by superior skill. And if I refuse? Eleanor asked. Though I could tell from her tone that she already knew the answer. Then, my boys and I will consider this whole crowd to be in rebellion against lawful authority, Morrison replied, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. And we'll deal with rebellions the way we always have, permanently. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, child. Morrison had turned Eleanor's challenge into an all-or-nothing gamble where the lives of 30 innocent people hung in the balance. She could face him alone and probably die, or she could refuse and watch him massacre everyone who'd been brave enough to stand with her. But Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez hadn't tracked a killer across hundreds of miles of hostile territory just to be outmaneuvered by a small-town tyrant. She looked around at the faces of the people who'd rallied to her cause, miners and shopkeepers, ranchers and their wives. Even a few children who'd crept out to watch the confrontation, and I saw something change in her expression. You're right, Morrison, she said, stepping forward until she was only 10 feet away from the gunfighter. This is about more than just Carlos Mendoza. This is about whether good people have the right to live free from fear, or whether cowards and killers get to rule through intimidation. She began unbuckling her gun belt, and for a moment I thought she was surrendering. But instead of dropping her weapons, she handed the belt to Pete Kowalski, who'd moved up to stand beside her. Hold these for me, Pete, she said quietly. I want to make sure Morrison understands exactly what kind of fight this is going to be. Morrison's pale eyes widened in surprise. What are you doing, woman? You can't face me unarmed. Eleanor smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. Who said anything about being unarmed? She reached into her boot and withdrew a knife, not a small hideout blade, but a serious fighting knife with a 7-inch blade that gleamed like silver in the afternoon sun. My husband taught me that there are 2 kinds of fights, Morrison, she said, testing the balance of the weapon in her hand. There are gunfights, where the fastest draw wins. And there are knife fights, where the smartest fighter wins. Since you've been hiding behind your reputation with a gun for so long, I thought we'd try something different. The crowd let out a collective gasp, and even Morrison's own men looked uncertain. Knife fighting was brutal, personal, and unpredictable, not the kind of clean, quick violence that gunfighters preferred. It was the kind of combat that required not just skill, but the willingness to get close enough to your enemy to smell their fear. Morrison's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. I don't fight women with knives like some back alley cutthroat. If you want to face me, you'll do it with guns like a civilized person. Civilized? Eleanor laughed, and the sound carried no humor at all. You call terrorizing innocent families civilized. You call protecting murderers and thieves civilized. No, Morrison, you've been acting like an animal for years. And now you're going to be treated like one. She began walking in a slow circle around Morrison, her knife held low and ready, her movements fluid as a cat stalking prey. The thing about knife fighting, Morrison, is that it shows who you really are underneath all the bluster and reputation, when you're close enough to see the fear in your enemy's eyes. When you can smell their sweat and hear their breathing, that's when you find out what kind of person you're really dealing with. Morrison drew his gun, but Eleanor was already moving, diving to the side and rolling behind a water trough before he could get a clear shot. The bullet splintered the wood inches from where her head had been, and the crowd scattered for cover as the gunfight they'd all been expecting finally began. But this wasn't the kind of formal duel that Morrison was used to. Eleanor was fighting like a guerrilla, using every piece of cover available, forcing Morrison to chase her through the obstacles and shadows of Main Street. She'd turned his own town into a battlefield where his advantages meant nothing. Morrison's first shot had missed, but it had also revealed something crucial about the kind of man he really was underneath all that reputation and swagger, instead of the cool, calculated gunfighter he pretended to be. He was just another bully who'd gotten used to people backing down before he had to prove himself in a real fight. Eleanor used that moment of revelation to her advantage, darting from behind the water trough to the cover of a hitching post, then to the wooden sidewalk that ran in front of the general store. Morrison fired again, his bullet splintering the boards where she'd been a split second before, but his shots were wild now, driven by frustration rather than skill. Stand still and fight like a man, Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of chasing a target that refused to behave the way his victims usually did. I'm not a man, Eleanor called back from somewhere behind the blacksmith's forge, her voice carrying clearly despite the cover between them. I'm something much more dangerous. I'm a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. That's when she did something that changed the entire nature of the confrontation. Instead of continuing to run and hide, Eleanor suddenly reversed course and began stalking Morrison, using the same guerrilla tactics but now as the hunter rather than the hunted. Morrison spun around, trying to track her movement, but Eleanor had learned the layout of our town during her brief stay, and she used every shadow, every corner, every piece of cover to her advantage. She appeared for just a moment, at the edge of his vision, long enough for him to fire another wild shot, then vanished again before he could get a proper bead on her. The thing about bullies, Morrison, Eleanor's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the buildings in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint her location, is that they're only dangerous when they're fighting people who are afraid of them. But I'm not afraid of you. I've faced Apache war parties, Mexican bandits, and desert storms that would make you wet yourself. You're just another coward with a gun. Morrison's face was red with rage and exertion now, sweat streaming down his cheeks as he spun in circles, trying to find a target that seemed to materialize and disappear like smoke. His remaining bullets were being wasted on shadows and echoes, and everyone watching could see that the feared gunfighter was being outmaneuvered by a woman with a knife. But It was what happened next that truly showed the measure of Elena Rodriguez de Vasquez. Instead of continuing the cat and mouse game until Morrison ran out of ammunition, she chose to end the fight in a way that would send a message to every outlaw and desperado in the territory. Elena stepped out into the open, maybe 20 feet, from where Morrison stood panting and wild-eyed, and she did something that made the entire crowd gasp in amazement. She threw her knife, not at Morrison, but into the dirt at his feet, where it stuck quivering in the dust like an exclamation. "Point there," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the danger she'd just placed herself in. "Now we're both armed with guns. You wanted a fair fight, Morrison. You've got one." Morrison stared at the knife in the dirt, then at Eleanor standing there with her hands at her sides. And for the first time since I'd known of him, I saw something in his pale eyes that I'd never expected to see. Respect, not fear, not anger, but genuine respect for an opponent who'd proven herself worthy of his attention. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," Morrison said slowly, "or the craziest, maybe both," Eleanor replied, "but I'm also the woman who's going to kill Carlos Mendoza today. With or without your permission. The only question is whether you're going to die trying to stop me." Morrison looked around at the crowd of townspeople who'd watched him being outfought and outmaneuvered by a lone woman with a knife. He could see the change in their faces. The way they were looking at him now, not with the fear and respect he'd grown accustomed to, but with something approaching contempt. His reign of terror had been built on the belief that he was invincible, that no one could stand against him and survive. But Eleanor had just proven that belief to be a lie, and everyone in Dry Creek had witnessed his humiliation. "You know what, Segarita," Morrison said finally, holstering his gun with a motion that seemed to take tremendous effort. "You've made your point. You want Mendoza, you can have him, but this ain't over between us. Someday, when you least expect it, I'm going to finish what we started here today." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was genuine warmth in the expression. "I'll be waiting, Morrison, but right now, I have business with a coward who's been hiding behind your reputation long enough." Morrison's retreat from the confrontation sent a ripple of shock through his gang. Child. These men had followed him for years, believing in his reputation as the fastest gun in Arizona territory. And watching him back down from a woman with a knife had shaken their faith to its very core. I could see the uncertainty in their faces as they looked from their leader to Eleanor, trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. Carlos Mendoza, who'd been cowering behind Morrison's men throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly found himself without protection. The gang members stepped away from him, leaving him standing alone in the saloon doorway like a man abandoned on a sinking ship. "Carlos," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying that same deadly calm that had marked her entire performance. "Your friend Morrison has decided he doesn't want to die for you today. That means it's just you and me, the way it should have been from the beginning." Mendoza's scarred face went through a series of expressions: fear, anger, desperation, and finally a kind of cornered animal cunning that made my blood run cold. "You think you've won something here, Eleanor," he snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "You think embarrassing Morrison changes anything? I still killed your precious Roberto, and there ain't nothing you can do to bring him back." The crowd let out a collective gasp at this casual admission of murder, and I saw several of the townspeople's faces harden with disgust. Even in a place like Dry Creek, where violence was commonplace, there was something particularly vile about a man who'd boast about killing someone in their sleep. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but I noticed her hand drift closer to where Pete Kowalski still held her gun belt. "You're right, Carlos," she said quietly. "I can't bring Roberto back, but I can make sure you never hurt anyone else the way you hurt him." That's when Mendoza made his move. drawing his gun with surprising speed for a man who'd shown nothing but cowardice up to that point. But Eleanor was ready for him, snatching her Colt from Pete's hands and bringing it to bear with the fluid motion of someone who'd practiced the draw thousands of times. The two shots rang out so close together they sounded like one, echoing off the buildings and sending birds scattering from their perches on the rooftops. For a moment, both Eleanor and Mendoza stood frozen, smoke curling from their weapons. And I held my breath waiting to see who would fall. Then Mendoza staggered backward, his gun dropping from nerveless fingers as a red stain spread across the front of his shirt. He looked down at the wound in his chest with an expression of surprise, as if he couldn't believe that someone had actually managed to shoot him. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ringing in everyone's ears. I was faster. I drew first. Eleanor lowered her smoking gun, her face showing no satisfaction or triumph, only a kind of weary sadness. "Speed isn't everything, Carlos. Sometimes accuracy matters more. Roberto taught me that, along with a lot of other things you'll never understand." Mendoza tried to take another step, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees in the dusty street. "The ring," he gasped, reaching into his shirt pocket with a shaking hand. "Roberto's ring, I still have it." He pulled out a simple gold band set with a small emerald, nothing fancy, but clearly precious to the woman who'd travelled so far to reclaim it. Eleanor walked over and knelt beside the dying man, taking the ring from his trembling fingers with surprising gentleness. "This was Roberto's grandfather's ring," she said, slipping it onto her own finger where it caught the afternoon sunlight. "It's been in his family for generations. You had no right to take it." Mendoza coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "The gold," he whispered, "army payroll, buried it behind the old mission in Sonora." Eleanor nodded, but I could see that the money meant nothing to her compared to the ring she'd just reclaimed. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "It will go back to the army, where it belongs." Mendoza died there in the street, his eyes staring up at the desert sky, and Eleanor stood slowly, brushing the dust from her knees. The confrontation that had held our entire town in its grip was finally over, but I could sense that the real consequences were just beginning. Morrison and his remaining men were still standing outside the saloon, their faces dark with anger and humiliation. They'd lost face in front of the entire town, and men like that don't forget such slights easily. "This ain't over, Segarita," Morrison said, his voice carrying a promise of future violence. "You may have gotten lucky today, but luck runs out eventually, and when it does, I'll be waiting." Eleanor holstered her gun and turned to face him, her dark eyes steady and unafraid. "I told you before, Morrison, I'll be waiting too, but right now I think you and your men need to decide whether you want to keep terrorizing people who've proven they're not afraid to fight back." Morrison's threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunpowder blast. "Child," and I could see the wheels turning in his pale eyes as he calculated his next move. He'd been humiliated in front of the entire town, his reputation as the fastest gun in Arizona territory shattered by a woman who'd outfought him with nothing but courage and determination. Men like Morrison don't survive such blows to their pride. They either regain their standing through violence, or they lose everything. "You made a mistake today, Segarita," Morrison said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded so many deaths over the years. "You should have killed me when you had the chance. Now I'm going to make sure you regret showing mercy to a man who don't deserve it." Eleanor stood her ground, her hand resting casually on her gun butt, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She'd won the immediate confrontation, but she was still outnumbered 6-1, and Morrison's men were starting to spread out in a way that suggested they were preparing for a coordinated attack. "The way I see it, Morrison," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the danger closing in around her, "you've got two choices. You can try to salvage your reputation by gunning down a woman in front of 30 witnesses, which will make you look like the coward you really are, or you can accept that your reign of terror in this town is over and move on to someplace where people haven't seen you get outfought by someone half your size. But Morrison was beyond rational thought now, driven by wounded pride and the knowledge that his entire empire of fear was crumbling around him. "Boys," he said to his men, his voice carrying the cold finality of a death sentence, "I think it's time we reminded these good folks what happens to people who forget their place." That's when the situation went from dangerous to desperate, child. Morrison's 6 gunmen began moving into position, creating a circle around Eleanor and the townspeople who'd rallied to her cause. These weren't the kind of men who worried about fair fights or innocent bystanders. They were killers who'd been given permission to do what they did best. Pete Kowalski stepped up beside Eleanor, his one good arm steady as he drew his old cavalry pistol. "Well, boys," he said with grim humor, "looks like we're about to find out what we're really made of." Other townspeople began reaching for whatever weapons they had, hunting rifles, shotguns, even pickaxes and shovels from the hardware store. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they tasted freedom for the first time in years, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. "This is your last chance, Morrison," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the tension crackling through the air. "Walk away now, and nobody else has to die today." Morrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Die, oh, Segarita, dying would be a mercy compared to what I've got planned for you. See, I've decided that killing you quick would be too easy. I'm going to make sure you live long enough to watch every person who stood with you today pay the price for their foolishness." He gestured to his men, and they began closing the circle. Their guns drawn and ready, the townspeople pressed closer, together, forming a defensive cluster around Eleanor, but everyone could see that they were hopelessly outmatched. Morrison's gang were professional killers, while most of the defenders were shopkeepers and miners who'd never been in a real gunfight. "You know what the funny thing is," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the conversational tone of a man discussing the weather. "If you'd just minded your own business, if you'd taken your revenge on Mendoza and left town, none of this would have been necessary. But you had to go and give these people ideas, had to make them think they could stand up to their betters." Eleanor's dark eyes swept the circle of gunmen, calculating distances and angles, looking for any advantage that might help her protect the innocent people who'd chosen to stand with her. But even I could see that the situation was hopeless. There were too many enemies, too little cover, and too many civilians who'd be caught in the crossfire. "I've got a better idea, Morrison," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Instead of massacring a bunch of innocent people, why don't you and I settle this the old-fashioned way? Just you and me, guns drawn, winner takes all." Morrison's pale eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "And why would I agree to that when I've got you exactly where I want you?" "Because," Eleanor replied, and I heard something in her voice that made my blood run cold. "If you don't, I'm going to tell everyone in this territory exactly what kind of man Jake Morrison really is. I'm going to spread the word that the famous gunfighter got outfought by a Mexican woman with a knife, that he had to hide behind 6 men to face one opponent, that he's nothing but a coward who preys on the weak and innocent." The threat hit Morrison like a physical blow, and I saw his face flush red with rage. His reputation was everything to him. Without it, he was just another aging gunman in a territory full of younger, faster killers looking to make their mark. But before he could respond to Eleanor's challenge, something happened that changed everything. From somewhere behind Morrison's men came the sound of approaching horses, not just 1 or 2, but a whole group riding hard toward town. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, Child and Morrison's men instinctively turned toward the sound, their guns wavering as they tried to identify this new threat. Through the dust cloud kicked up by the horses, I could make out the glint of metal badges and the distinctive blue uniforms that meant only one thing. The U.S. cavalry had finally come to Dry Creek. Leading the column was Captain James Mitchell, a career soldier with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier violence to be impressed by small-town tyrants. Behind him rode 20 troopers, all armed and looking like men who'd been riding hard with a specific purpose in mind. Morrison's face went pale as he realized what this meant. The cavalry didn't make social calls to places like Dry Creek. They came when there were reports of serious lawlessness, when territorial authorities had finally decided that a situation had gotten out of hand. Captain Mitchell, Morrison called out, trying to regain some of his lost composure. What brings the army to our little town? We weren't expecting any official visits. Captain Mitchell dismounted and walked toward the confrontation, his hand resting on his saber hilt in a way that suggested he was ready for trouble. We received word that there was a disturbance here, Morrison, reports of gunfire, threats against civilians. The usual sort of thing that seems to follow you wherever you go. Eleanor stepped forward, and I could see the relief in her posture as she realized that help had arrived at exactly the right moment. Captain, I'm Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez. I came here to apprehend the man who murdered my husband, and I've found myself caught up in a larger conflict with Mr. Morrison and his associates. Segura Vasquez, Captain Mitchell said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect, we've been looking for you. The Mexican authorities sent word that you were pursuing Carlos Mendoza across the border, and they asked us to provide assistance if needed. Morrison's confidence was crumbling like a house built on sand, but he made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the situation. Now see here, Captain. This is a local matter. The Army has no jurisdiction over civilian disputes in territorial towns. You're right about jurisdiction, Morrison, Captain Mitchell replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent decades enforcing law on the frontier. But we do have jurisdiction over crimes that cross international borders, and murder is murder whether it happens in Mexico or Arizona territory. He gestured toward the body of Carlos Mendoza, still lying in the dusty street where Eleanor had shot him. I'm assuming this is the man in question. It is, Eleanor confirmed. He confessed to killing my husband before he died, and he returned the ring he'd stolen from Roberto's body. Captain Mitchell nodded grimly. Then justice has been served, at least in that matter. But I'm afraid we have other business to discuss. Morrison, you and your men are wanted for questioning in connection with several robberies and murders that have taken place along the territorial roads. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but the sight of 20 cavalry carbines pointed in his direction made him think better of it. His men were looking around nervously, realizing that their numerical advantage had evaporated with the arrival of professional soldiers. This is harassment, Captain, Morrison said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. You can't prove we've done anything wrong. Maybe not, Captain Mitchell admitted. But we can certainly escort you and your associates to the territorial capital, where a judge can sort out the details. I'm sure you won't mind cooperating with a proper legal investigation. That's when Morrison made the mistake that sealed his fate, Child, instead of accepting the inevitable and going quietly. He let his wounded pride override his common sense. I ain't going nowhere with you, soldier boy, he snarled, his hand dropping toward his gun. This is still my town, and I don't take orders from anyone. The moment Morrison's fingers touched his gun, but Eleanor moved with the lightning speed that had already proven superior to his own. Her Colt cleared leather and fired before Morrison could complete his draw, the bullet taking him in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. Morrison hit the ground hard, his gun flying from his nerveless fingers, and suddenly, his remaining men found themselves facing not just Eleanor and the townspeople, but 20 cavalry troopers with their weapons trained and ready. "Drop your guns," Captain Mitchell commanded, his voice carrying the snap of absolute authority. "Anyone who reaches for a weapon will be shot down like a rabid dog, one by one." Morrison's men let their guns fall to the dust, their faces showing the defeat and resignation of men who'd finally met their match. The reign of terror that had gripped Dry Creek for 3 long years was finally over, broken by the courage of one woman who'd refused to be intimidated by reputation and bluster. Morrison lay in the dust, clutching his wounded shoulder, child, his face twisted with pain and the bitter knowledge that his empire of fear had finally crumbled. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining the dirt beneath him, but the wound wasn't fatal. Eleanor had chosen her shot carefully, aiming to disable rather than kill. Captain Mitchell knelt beside the fallen gunfighter, examining the wound with the practiced eye of a soldier who'd seen plenty of battlefield injuries. "You'll live, Morrison," he said without sympathy, "which is more than you deserve after all the people you've terrorized over the years." Eleanor holstered her smoking gun and looked around at the scene of their victory. Morrison's men stood with their hands raised, their weapons scattered in the dust, their faces showing the defeat of men who'd finally met their match. The townspeople who'd rallied to her cause were embracing each other, tears of relief streaming down faces that had been marked by fear for far too long. "It's over," Pete Kowalski said, his gruff voice thick with emotion. "After 3 years of living under Morrison's thumb, it's finally over." But Eleanor wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. She walked over to where Morrison lay, her dark eyes studying the man who'd built his reputation on the suffering of innocent people. "You made a mistake, Morrison," she said quietly, her voice carrying no triumph, only a kind of weary satisfaction. "You thought fear was the same thing as respect, that intimidation was the same thing as strength, but real strength comes from protecting people, not preying on them." Morrison glared up at her through eyes glazed with pain and hatred. "This ain't over, Segarita," he gasped. "There's others like me out there, others who'll come looking for the woman who brought down Jake Morrison." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, the expression held genuine warmth instead of cold determination. "Let them come," she said simply. "I'll be ready for them too." Captain Mitchell had his men bind Morrison's wound and prepare him for transport, along with the rest of his gang. "You'll all be taken to Tucson for trial," he announced. "The territorial judge will decide what happens to you from there," as the cavalry prepared to leave with their prisoners. Captain Mitchell approached Eleanor with an expression of professional respect. "Segura Vasquez, I have to say, what you did here today was remarkable. You faced down 7 armed men and lived to tell about it. That takes a special kind of courage." Eleanor shook her head modestly. "I didn't do it alone, Captain. These people." She gestured toward the townspeople who'd stood with her. "They're the ones who showed real courage. They risked everything to stand up for what was right, even when they had every reason to be afraid." "What will you do now?" Captain Mitchell asked. "Will you be returning to Mexico?" Eleanor looked around at the faces of the people who'd become her allies in the fight against Morrison's tyranny. "I think I'll stay in Dry Creek for a while," she said. "These folks have been through a lot, and they might need someone to help them rebuild their community. Besides," she added with a smile, "I've grown fond of this place." The crowd of townspeople erupted in cheers at this announcement, and I saw tears of gratitude in many eyes. Eleanor had given them more than just freedom from Morrison's oppression. She'd given them back their dignity, their sense of community. Their belief that good people could triumph over evil when they stood together. As the cavalry rode out of town with their prisoners, taking Jake Morrison and his gang away forever, the people of Dry Creek began to celebrate their liberation. Someone brought out a fiddle. Others contributed food and drink, and soon Main Street was filled with music and laughter for the first time in years. Eleanor stood apart from the celebration, watching the joy on faces that had been marked by fear for so long. I approached her, wanting to thank her for what she'd done for our community. "Mrs. Vasquez," I said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You've given us back our town, our freedom, our hope." She turned to me with those dark eyes that had seen so much pain and loss, but now held something new, peace, perhaps, or at least the beginning of healing. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Thornton," she said. "What happened here today wasn't about me getting revenge for Roberto's death. It was about proving that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to let evil triumph." The celebration in the streets of Dry Creek continued well into the evening, with music and laughter echoing off the buildings that had witnessed so much fear and violence over the past 3 years. But for Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez, the real victory wasn't in the defeat of Jake Morrison or the liberation of our town. It was in something much more profound and lasting. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor found herself surrounded by the people she'd helped to free. They came to her one by one: miners who'd been forced to pay protection money, shopkeepers who'd been robbed and beaten, families who'd lived in constant fear of Morrison's arbitrary violence. "Segura Vasquez," said Mrs. Patterson, tears streaming down her weathered face, "my children will grow up free because of what you did today. How can we ever repay such a debt?" Eleanor took the older woman's hands in her own, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Patterson. What happened here today was the result of your own courage, your willingness to stand up for what was right even when it seemed hopeless. I just gave you the opportunity to show the world what kind of people you really are." But it was young Billy Morrison, no relation to the gunfighter, who asked the question that had been weighing on everyone's mind. "Mrs. Vasquez, what's going to happen to us now? What if other bad men come to town? What if we can't protect ourselves without you?" Eleanor knelt down to the boy's level, her dark eyes serious but kind. "Billy, do you know what I learned today? I learned that the people of Dry Creek are much stronger than they ever imagined. You stood together against men who'd been terrorizing you for years, and you won. That strength doesn't come from having the fastest gun or the biggest gang. It comes from caring about each other, from being willing to sacrifice for your community." She stood and addressed the entire crowd that had gathered around her. Morrison and his men ruled through fear, but fear is a weak foundation for power. It crumbles the moment people decide they're not afraid anymore. What you've built here today, this sense of community, this willingness to stand together, that's something no gunfighter can destroy. Pete Kowalski stepped forward, his grizzled face showing more emotion than I'd ever seen from the tough old cavalry veteran. "Eleanor's right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "We've learned something important today. We've learned that we don't have to be victims, that we can fight back when evil comes calling, and we've learned that we're stronger together than any of us ever imagined we could be alone." The crowd murmured agreement, and I could see the change in their faces. The fear and resignation that had marked them for so long was being replaced by something new. Pride, perhaps, confidence, the knowledge that they'd faced the worst kind of evil and emerged victorious. Eleanor walked to the center of the street where Carlos Mendoza had died, where she'd reclaimed her husband's ring and found the justice she'd traveled so far to obtain. She looked down at the simple gold band on her finger, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw tears in her dark eyes. "Roberto," she whispered, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying to every person present. "I kept my promise. I found the man who killed you, and I made him pay for what he did. But more than that, I found something you always believed in, the power of good people to stand together against evil." She looked up at the crowd, her voice growing stronger. "My husband was a soldier, a man who believed that the strong had a duty to protect the weak, that justice was worth fighting for no matter the cost. He would have been proud of what happened here today. Proud of all of you for finding the courage to reclaim your town and your freedom." The celebration continued around us, but Eleanor seemed to withdraw into herself, processing the events of the day and the emotions that came with finally achieving the justice she'd sought for so long. I approached her as she stood apart from the crowd, wanting to offer whatever comfort I could to a woman who'd given so much of herself for strangers. "Mrs. Vasquez," I said quietly, "are you all right? You look like the weight of the world is on your shoulders." She smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, the expression was free of the cold determination that had marked her every action. "I'm fine, Mrs. Thornton. It's just, for so long, my life has been focused on one thing: finding Carlos Mendoza and making him pay for Roberto's death. Now that it's done, I'm not sure what comes next." "What comes next," I said, "is whatever you choose to make of it. You've proven that you're capable of extraordinary things, that you have the strength and courage to face any challenge. The question is, what do you want to do with those gifts?" Eleanor looked around at the celebrating townspeople, at the faces that had been transformed from fear to joy in the space of a single day. "I think," she said slowly, "I want to make sure this never happens again. Not here, not anywhere. There are too many Jake Morrisons in this world, too many Carlos Mendozas preying on innocent people. Maybe it's time someone did something about that. That was 46 years ago, child. And I'm the only one left who remembers the full truth about Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez and what she did for the town of Dry Creek in the summer of 1879. Most folks who lived through that terrible time under Jake Morrison's rule have passed on to their eternal rest. And those who remain prefer to tell sanitized versions of the story, tales that make it sound like the cavalry just happened to arrive at the right moment to rest. Some troublemakers, but you and I know the real truth, don't we? We know that it was one woman's courage, one woman's refusal to let evil go unpunished, that broke the back of tyranny in our little corner of Arizona territory. Eleanor didn't just kill the man who murdered her husband, she showed an entire community that they had the power to stand up for themselves, that bullies and killers only have as much power as good people are willing to give them. Eleanor kept her word about staying in Dry Creek, at least for a while. She spent the next 2 years helping us rebuild our community, teaching young men and women how to defend themselves, organizing a proper town council to replace the fear-based system that Morrison had imposed. She helped us write a charter, establish real laws, and create the kind of civic institutions that make a place worth living in. But more importantly, she taught us something that no amount of money or legislation could provide. She taught us to believe in ourselves. Under Morrison's rule, we'd become a town of victims, people who kept their heads down and hoped that trouble would pass them by. Eleanor showed us that we could be heroes instead, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood together for what was right. The changes in Dry Creek were remarkable to witness, child. Within 6 months of Morrison's defeat, we had a real sheriff, not some drunk who took orders from outlaws, but a former cavalry sergeant who'd served with Captain Mitchell and understood the difference between law and lawlessness. We established a school where children could learn without fear, a church where families could worship in peace, and businesses that could operate without paying protection money to thugs. Eleanor herself became something of a legend throughout Arizona Territory. Word spread about the Mexican woman who'd faced down Jake Morrison and his gang, who'd liberated an entire town through sheer force of will and determination. Other communities that were suffering under similar tyrannies began reaching out to her, asking for help, begging her to come and do for them what she'd done for us. And she went, child. Over the next decade, Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez became a one-woman army against the forces of lawlessness that plagued the frontier. She helped drive out corrupt sheriffs in 3 different towns, organized citizens' militias to protect homesteaders from rustlers and claim jumpers, and personally tracked down more than a dozen wanted men who thought they could hide in the wilderness forever. She never remarried, never settled down in one place for very long. When people asked her why, she'd always give the same answer: Roberto and I had our time together, and it was beautiful, but he's gone now, and I have work to do in his memory. There are too many Jake Morrisons in this world, too many people who think they can prey on the innocent without consequences. The last time I saw Eleanor was in the spring of 1889, when she stopped in Dry Creek during one of her travels. She was 50 years old by then, her black hair streaked with silver, her face marked by years of desert sun and frontier hardship, but her eyes still held that same fire. That same determination that had faced down Morrison and his gang a decade earlier. How are things here, Abby? She asked as we sat on my front porch, watching the children play in streets that were now safe for them to explore. Good, I told her honestly. Better than good. We've got ourselves a real community now, the kind of place where people look out for each other instead of just trying to survive. And it's all because of what you showed us that day, Eleanor smiled. But I could see the weariness in her expression. It's not because of me, Abby. It's because you and your neighbors found the courage to stand up for yourselves. I just gave you the opportunity to show the world what kind of people you really were. She left town the next morning, riding out into the desert on the trail of another outlaw, another injustice that needed to be corrected. That was the last anyone in Dry Creek ever saw of Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez. Those stories about her continued to filter back to us for years afterward. Some said she'd been killed in a gunfight with rustlers near the Mexican border. Others claimed she'd retired to a ranch in California, finally finding the peace that had eluded her for so long. A few insisted they'd seen her as recently as the turn of the century, still tracking down bad men and protecting the innocent folks who couldn't protect themselves. I like to think she's still out there somewhere, child, still fighting the good fight, still showing people that they don't have to be victims of evil men with guns. Because that's what Eleanor taught us, that heroism isn't about being the fastest draw or the toughest fighter. It's about being willing to stand up for what's right, even when you're scared, even when the odds are against you. Even when it would be easier to just keep your head down and hope trouble passes you by. The sun's setting now behind these familiar mountains, and I can feel my time growing short. My bones ache with the weight of years and memories, and sometimes I hear voices calling to me from beyond the veil, not the angry cries of the unjustly killed, but the gentle welcome of those who found peace at last. But I'm not afraid. I know that when my time comes, I'll see Eleanor again, and Roberto, and all the other brave souls who stood up to evil and refused to let it triumph. We'll be together again, in a place where justice doesn't have to be won at gunpoint, where good people don't have to fear the night. Until then, I'll keep telling this story, keeping the memory alive, making sure that the truth is passed down to those who need to hear it. Because that's what witnesses do. We remember, we testify, and we make sure that the sacrifices of heroes like Eleanor Rodriguez de Vasquez are never forgotten. Now you know the real story of the woman who defied the gunfighters, who showed an entire town that they didn't have to live in fear, who proved that one person with courage can change the world. It's a story worth remembering, worth honoring. worth passing on to future generations who might need to find their own courage when evil comes calling. Remember this tale, child. Remember it and let it inspire you to stand up for what's right, to protect those who can't protect themselves. To never let bullies and tyrants convince you that their power is greater than your principles. That's the end of my witness account. Dear one, the fire's burning low, and it's time for an old woman to rest, but the story will live on. As long as there are people willing to listen and remember and carry the torch of justice forward into the darkness, and that's the most powerful legacy of all.